to do is just focus a little bit on the question of human rights of migrants. And in particular, they are referred to as refugees. And I haven't referred to them myself as refugees because I don't know if you know that the word refugee is a term of art. And it is far from certain that all of those people on those boats and all of those people interviewed would actually qualify as refugee. And this is, I think, highly problematic. People fleeing from situations such as Syria won't always fit the definition of refugee. So if you can keep your questions, because they are very good ones, but my colleagues, I'm sure, are going to be dealing with this across the week. And what I want to do is focus on the question of the human rights of migrants. Did anything strike you about the fact that these people, and I'm going to continue referring to them as migrants, to make it as inclusive as possible rather than exclusive, did it strike you as strange that they were taking such risky forms of transport? Why is that? Why don't they have choice? We were told, do you remember how much it cost to travel by ferry? Legally, by ferry. 22 euros. Why were they paying 1,200 euros? 12,000 euros? But why can't they travel by ferry? Anyone? Yeah. Visas. This is the problem. For most of the refugee-producing states, individuals have to get a visa in order to travel. If you don't have a visa, and if you don't have a passport to which to attach that visa, you cannot get onto a ferry. You cannot travel legally. And this is the problem. And carriers, that is airlines and shipping companies, are obliged to check your documents. Next time you go to the airport, think about who's checking your documents. It's not merely immigration control. It is the airline. And if you don't have the right documents, you won't be. I'll tell you a funny story. I was traveling from the USA back. My husband was living in the USA, and I was shuttling between the USA and the UK. And I happened to be a dual national. And I have Canadian nationality. My British passport had run out, so I could not present the airline with my British passport. So I had to present them with my Canadian passport. And they looked at it and they said, "Oh, why are you going to England?" And I said, "Well, I live there, my job is there." "Well, you don't have a visa." And then they said, "You can't travel on this passport at all." And I said, "Don't be ridiculous, I've traveled on this before." Anyway, long story short, they thought it was a Chinese passport. And because there was no visa, Canadians can travel easily backwards and forwards, but because they thought it was a Chinese passport, I don't know, China, Canadian, you know, they were going to, this was the airline that was going to prevent me, not the immigration people. So this is, I think, the heart of the problem. When you make it almost impossible to travel, then people in desperate need will use and take desperate measures. I would love to say yes, NGOs and civil society should rise up, but all we are seeing is the exact reverse. The West, and indeed countries of the South, are tightening up their borders increasingly, year on year on year. There seems to be no reversal of this. And one of the problems, I mean, it's such a huge topic, but one of the problems is that it doesn't matter which political party is in power, it seems. Left and right are pandering, in my view, to this populist agenda that we must cut the numbers of people who arrive in Europe. We must restrict access to our territories. We must keep the marauding masses out. That seems to be the rhetoric that is peddled not only by politicians, but also by newspapers, by broadcasters. And I think this is part of the problem, is that the general population, if you would ask them about migrants, even fairly well-educated people, they would sort of wring their hands and they would say, "Wow, it's a big problem, and we can't have all these foreigners coming in to take our jobs." And you will hear this, no doubt, right across this week, that this is one of the narratives that is put across, that people are coming here to take something away from us. There is very, very seldom a narrative around people are coming to give us things, to enrich our societies, to contribute to our economy, to do the jobs that other people don't want to do. You very seldom hear that rhetoric, and that's the problem. And so, one of the things I tell my students is, go out. When you finish this course, go out and change that rhetoric. Inform people, educate people, get them to understand that migrants, I'm a migrant. Many of you are migrants. We're most of us migrants well, not most of us in the world, but there are so many migrants in the world that it has become commonplace. And to regard people from the outside as somehow other is, I think, deeply suspect. And that's what I want to talk about a bit now. I'm not going to have time to cover everything that I wanted to talk about, but was there a quick question there? No? Okay, so what I want to do is look at I don't know how many of you have studied international human rights law before. Hands up? Oh, good, fantastic. Okay, so what I want to do is question and subject to real critique that the allegation or the claim that human rights are universal. The claims are that human rights inhere in us as human beings. By virtue of our humanity, we are entitled to claim various human rights. And what I want to say is that the place of the migrant really challenges that claim of universality. Whether the migrant is an asylum seeker, a refugee with refugee status, a trafficked person, a smuggled person who may or may not be a refugee, an irregular migrant, i.e. a migrant without papers who happens to be in the country concerned, any kind of migrant, it seems to me, challenges very seriously the notion that human rights are universal and they inhere in us by virtue of our humanity. So, just to remind you of the kinds of risks that people take. This is a bird's eye view of one of the kinds of boats that, this isn't a rubber dinghy, fortunately. This looks like it's at least it's a solid piece of plastic, but nevertheless, you can see the risks that people take. And when we consider the various types of migrants, I would suggest we can see very clearly that their humanity gets eclipsed. Their humanity gets eclipsed behind the rhetoric that plays to chances of electoral victory. We've seen this vividly played out in the Donald Trump campaign when he claimed that he was going to build a wall. There is already a wall, but they're going to extend the wall to keep out Mexicans. And we have, a number of scholars have said, and I think that absolutely correctly, that there is also now a tension between the human rights of migrants on the one hand and the claims of national security on the other. And Krauss has suggested that whilst this tension has always existed, it has intensified since the terrorist attacks in the United States of September the 11th, 2001. Now, you will also know, probably from reading newspapers, I hope you read newspapers and watch reputable news channels, migrants are seldom referred to without pejorative adjectives attached to them. So you'll get things like illegal immigrants, bogus, Muslim, as in a pejorative term. You seldom hear the word Muslim and migrant used without also the word terrorist attached to it. And so what we have now is often that the narrative around migration is linked inextricably with questions of fear, terror, terrorism, people from the outside wanting to undermine our way of life. And it seems that the rhetoric takes us to what Hannah Arendt has articulated as beyond the pale of law. These people, migrants, are, because of the way they are portrayed on the one hand and dealt with by the law on the other hand, they are actually, many of them, beyond the pale of law. They do not have the protection that you and I have. They don't have human rights protection that we might think they ought to have. And what is at stake, I think, from an international law point of view, is on the one side, the state's sovereign right to protect their borders, the state's sovereign right to determine who should enter and who should stay, on the one hand, and on the other hand, each state's obligations under human rights treaties. And I mean, when I talk about human rights treaties, I'm going to include in that, it's not always included as a human rights treaty, but nevertheless, I will include it, the Refugee Convention. So when we consider the number of migrants in the world today, it soon becomes clear that we are facing an enormous gap between the rhetoric of universality, of human rights, and reality. According to the International Organization of Migration, in 2015, 1 in every 7 people in the world was a migrant. 1 in every 7. That's over 1 billion people. Now, some of those are internal migrants. Those are many of whom were internally displaced, who live lives very much like those in refugee camps. They live in internal displacement camps. They are not palaces, I can assure you. Of the 1 billion, 244 million were international migrants, and this was a 40% increase on the figure in 2000. So we are seeing increasing numbers of people on the move. 740 million were internally displaced. And as I say, internal displacement is a problem which almost eclipses the problems of international migration. So what I want to do, I was going to try and look at 3 groups of people, refugees and asylum seekers, one group trafficked and smuggled, another group and undocumented another. I think probably what I will do in the time allotted is C. Just I'll wait and see how many I can get through. So what I want to do is to look at some of the claims in international human rights instruments of universality, and we will see that claims to universality articulated in the UN Charter, the Universal Declaration, and the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights are subject to real challenge by the place of the migrant, as I've said. We will see, whilst it's not immediately obvious to most people when looking at these instruments, unless you are a migration law specialist, the tension between the claims to universality on the one hand and the state's sovereign right to control who is permitted to stay underpins the whole human rights project. And if we look at these three groups of people, the trafficked and smuggled, the undocumented, and refugees and asylum seekers, what we'll see is this tension really played out. So human rights instruments. The creation of the UN in 1945 and the drafting of the Universal Declaration in 1948 need to be seen in their immediate historical context. Adopted just 6 weeks after VE Day in Victory Europe Day, the UN was created by virtue of the UN Charter. You probably all know about the UN Charter. And it was in reaction, in large part, to the devastation of 2 world wars and in response to the atrocities of Nazi Germany. And as Hannah Arendt points out, the Nazi regime started by stripping Jews of their rights. They started by stripping their nationality. So Jews no longer were able to be German citizens, for example. When they were stripped of their nationality and the world showed no signs of doing anything about this, no adverse reaction, the regime then embarked on the final solution, the extermination of European Jewry by systematically gassing them to death, as you know. Now, while not wanting to stretch things too far, I think we can see that there are some alarming parallels between Hannah Arendt's Beyond the Pale of Law with respect to European Jewry at the time of the Nazi regime, with respect to migrants. So there's some alarming parallels. And in particular, I would suggest that there are some alarming parallels with regard to undocumented migrants, those who managed to get smuggled or trafficked into mainly Europe and North America, They go under the radar, they don't have any documents, and very often they are in extremely weak and easily exploitable situations because they don't have documents. One of the things I was wanting to, and I don't have time to show you this, but I'll give these slides to whoever is organizing this. And you can see the clip here. This was a Guardian article of an interview with a trauma expert from Australia who was engaged in work to do with detention centers in Nauru. Nauru and another island, another country off Australia. What happened was Australia decided that anyone who arrived by sea to claim asylum would automatically be sent to Nauru, where they would be, their refugee status would be ascertained, and in Nauru they would be detained. And this trauma expert said that this was some of the worst detention conditions he had seen in 43 years of his work as a trauma expert, and he had seen some pretty terrible traumas. He said in other situations you saw hope, but in the situation of detention pending refugee status determination on the island state of Nauru, he said the trauma was horrific because people had no sense of when or if they would ever be released from detention. There was no hope. So what I want to do is to briefly look at the UN Charter. The UN Charter preamble says, "We, the peoples of the UN, determined to save succeeding generations from the scourge of war and affirm faith." I love it that they say reaffirm faith in human rights. Nobody had really articulated human rights before this. Reaffirmed faith in human rights, in the dignity and worth of the person, in the equal rights of men and women. Article 1 of the UN Charter outlines some of the purposes of the United Nations. And you can see that in subparagraph 3, one of the things that it is determined to do is promote and encourage respect for human rights and fundamental freedoms for all without distinction as to race, sex, language, or religion. These categories get widened out as we go. Article 55 commits the UN to promote universal respect for and observance of human rights and fundamental freedoms without distinction. And then by virtue of Article 56, member states have got to work together to promote these objectives. That's legal obligation. Then on the 10th of December 1948, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights was adopted, and the preamble speaks of the recognition of the inherent dignity of the human person. So we're talking about human beings, all members of the human family, and of the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family. The preamble goes on to speak about the disregard and contempt for human rights which resulted in the barbarous acts of the Second World War, and in particular they're referring to Nazi Germany, that outraged the conscience of mankind. And then it goes on to say it's essential that human rights should be protected by the rule of law, and that the people of the UN reaffirmed their faith when they adopted the UN Charter in fundamental human rights, in dignity of worth of the human person, and in equal rights of men and women. And Article 1 of the Universal Declaration provides that all human beings are born free and equal in dignity, and everyone in Article 2 is entitled to the rights and freedoms set forth without distinction of any kind. Now, this is where the grounds of discrimination are widened much more expansively than they were in the UN, or articulated more expansively than the UN Charter, without distinction of any kind, such as. So this is a non-exhaustive list. So all well and good so far. Now, you may know, and I hope those of you who studied international law and international human rights law, you will know that the Universal Declaration, being a declaration, is not binding in and of itself. It is not a treaty and therefore doesn't have the force of treaty law, although many of its articles have been argued to have passed into customary international law. But what you needed next in order to impose legal obligations on states in relation to human rights was to produce a treaty and get states to sign up to that treaty. So the first of these, well, there were two that were adopted at the same time, but the one we're looking at for now is the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights. And the preamble refers back to the UN Charter, recognition of the inherent dignity and equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family, and recognizing these rights derived from the inherent dignity of the person. So we see these rehearsed now in treaty form. So you and I, we have inherent dignity, it says so, by virtue of this treaty, and as a result of that, we have certain human rights that are inalienable. Article 2 echoes Article 1 of the Universal Declaration, and it says each state party undertakes to respect and ensure to all individuals within its territory and subject to its jurisdiction. Note it doesn't say citizen here. This is really vital. It does not say citizen. It is not exclusive here. It's everyone, and it has been interpreted to the and between territory and has been interpreted more broadly as or. So within the territory or subject to the jurisdiction of the member state. So in other words, when you are in the territory of a state party to the ICCPR, whether or not you are a citizen, you are entitled to these rights by virtue of the fact that human rights inhere and so on. I've just given you a comparison to the ECHR. It's very similar. But, and here's where we begin to see some of the problems. Article 12 of the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights already sees a distinction between people lawfully present and those who are not lawfully present. Article 12 says that everyone lawfully within the territory of a state shall, within that territory, have the right of liberty of movement and freedom to choose his residence. So that the inference is if you're not lawfully within the territory, you do not have those rights. So already, as I say, even though the claims to universality and the inherent dignity of the person, we can see that even the UN, the sort of touchstone for human rights, the UN ICCPR, has recognized that some people will not be entitled to the full panoply of human rights. And if you look at Article 13, it talks of aliens lawfully within the territory of a state. Now, aliens lawfully within the territory of a state have certain protections. They cannot be expelled except pursuant to a decision taken by, in accordance with the law, etc., for the reasons that are articulated here. The inference, of course, is that if you are not lawfully within the territory, you could be expelled without this legal procedure. So already we are seeing first and second class people. The general comment of the Human Rights Committee brings our attention to this quite clearly. So the Human Rights Committee is the body that was established by the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights to oversee its implementation. And it has issued a number of general comments as a means, or as an aid of interpretation. And General Comment 15 says that it relates to the position of aliens under the covenant, and it says it doesn't cover irregular migrants. So the general rule is that each one of the rights of the covenant must be guaranteed without discrimination between citizens and aliens. Aliens receive the benefit of the general requirement of non-discrimination, blah, blah, blah. But exceptionally, some of the rights recognized in the covenant are expressly applicable only to citizens. Article 25 and Article 13 only applies to aliens. Yeah, it is completely a matter of national law as to who is a citizen and who is an alien, and who is entitled to citizenship. If we look at Article 25, it is guaranteed only to citizens. So every citizen has the right and opportunity to take part in the public affairs of a state. to vote and be elected and so on. So we can see again that not all rights inhere in the individual. Some rights are applicable only to citizens. And there are a number of other limitations. As the late Joan Fitzpatrick points out, there are other groups where it is legitimate for a state to distinguish between a national and an alien. So there are those rights that prohibit arbitrary state action. This may permit distinctions to be made between nationals and migrants, such as arbitrary arrest and detention. So, for example, the provision on arrest and detention under Article 9 of the ICCPR does not exclude the possibility of having immigration detention for migrants only. You can't have immigration detention for nationals, clearly. But it isn't excluded that that possibility of having immigration detention only for non-nationals. And there are also limitations. For example, the right to freedom of expression under Article 19 of the ICCPR is articulated as that everyone has the right to freedom of expression on the one hand, and then there are limitations on the other in the interest of national security and so on. And those national security provisions, or the national security provisions, can enable a state to distinguish between a national and a foreigner, because the foreigner may be determined to be, by virtue of his or her foreignness, a threat to national security. Now, the Migrant Workers Convention. So that is the ICCPR is a treaty of general application. It applies to all human beings, and it's in essence the rights that it covers are essentially those that are often referred to as first-generation rights. They are civil and political rights, so things like the right to freedom of expression, the right to freedom of assembly, the right to a fair trial, the prohibition against torture, and so on. Now, there are a number of treaties that were adopted at the international level in order to kind of specialize, in order to articulate rights of particular groups, where it was felt that specific groups, such as women or a particular category of people, needed specific protection. And the Migrant Workers Convention was one of them. But nowhere is the tension between the need to guarantee protection of human rights on the one hand and the urgent need to protect sovereignty on the other more felt than in this particular human rights instrument. At first sight, it looks brilliant. It protects migrant workers and their families, and you would think, great. Finally, the international community has woken up to the fact that migrant workers and their families are vulnerable. And the great thing is, as well, is that it protects not only regular migrants, but also irregular migrants. That is to say, people who are working, let's say in the UK, who are present here and working, but they are quote unquote illegal. I don't use the word illegal, I use irregular. I don't think any human being should be described as an illegal human being. But you will see this terminology bandied about irregular and illegal. Now, the preamble, yes. 49. 49, not good. And it's mostly non-Western states. So it is a great treaty. I might be wrong, it might be 50, but last I looked, it was 49. It looks like a great treaty when you first look at it, but when you look more closely, firstly at the number of ratifications, and secondly, what it articulates and how it is so different from other human rights instruments. But it starts out saying that migrant workers and their families are vulnerable. They can be, they're not all. So I'm a migrant worker, but I'm not particularly vulnerable. But many migrant workers are vulnerable. And particularly, as I say, those who are in irregular status. And they frequently find themselves owing, amongst other things, to their absence from their state of origin and to the difficulties they may encounter arising from their presence in the state of employment. So the whole point of this is to provide protection to people who are working away from their country of origin. And And it goes on to say, bearing in mind that human problems involved in migration are even more serious in the case of irregular migration. Hurrah, people recognize now that those in irregular status are vulnerable. The Prime Minister of the UK, Theresa May, well, I don't know if she's still a Prime Minister, but she was when I last looked this morning. She has vowed to make a hostile environment for migrants in this country, and in particular for those who are in irregular status. And the laws that have been, or rather the immigration rules and immigration law that have been changed, have made it almost impossible for an irregular person to have access to a hospital, a school, housing, or employment. So what happens is these people who are in irregular status, they don't go home. They're not going to go back to Aleppo. They're not going to go back to Afghanistan. They go underground. They find landlords who are willing to lease them property that is unfit for human habitation. They work in conditions that most human beings would find degrading and dangerous. And they go to their friends and relatives when they have medical needs, and they get along, they get by. The problem is there is no evidence that I have found to suggest that making a hostile environment will deter people from arriving. People will still come. And it's not to say that there aren't debates to be had about these things. Don't get me wrong. I don't think we all live in a potential utopia where anyone can travel anywhere and get a job wherever they like. But at the same time, if we're talking about human rights and we're talking about universality, we also have to recognize that migrants are also human beings. Anyway, but even in this preamble, we see this tension between human rights and protecting national sovereignty. And so in a human rights instrument, you don't often find this, but even in the preamble, states are encouraged to prevent and eliminate clandestine movements and trafficking in migrant workers. Now, you might think, oh, this is good. This is clamping down on the evil of traffickers. But you saw in that documentary that people rely on traffickers and smugglers. They don't want to, but they rely on them to get them from place A to place B, from a country where they're no longer safe to a country where they hope to be safe, or a country they're transiting through, as we saw in the case of Turkey. So the treaty is remarkable in the one way, in that it recognizes that there are undocumented people, undocumented migrants and their families in countries that are states parties to the treaty. But the problem is that it also recognizes that states have an obligation, or rather it confers upon states this obligation to prevent. So the language of preventing clandestine movements is telling states that they've got an obligation as a matter of international law. It's no longer a matter of their own domestic policy, but as a matter of international law. If you're a party to this treaty, you've got to take action to prevent clandestine movements of people. That's in a human rights instrument. You don't see that very often. And that's only in the preamble. We will see in Article 68, again, this is a human rights treaty, but it's telling states, including states of transit, shall collaborate with a view to preventing and eliminating illegal and clandestine movements and employment of migrant workers in an irregular situation. So states are, what I haven't said is that this treaty is designed to provide human rights protection. Well, I did say it, but not. And there are two groups of rights: those that apply to all migrants, whether irregular or irregular, and those that apply, a bigger subset of rights that apply to regular migrants. But at the same time, states that are party to this treaty must take action to prevent people working in an irregular situation and to prevent people from moving from one state to another. States, Article 69, so Article 68, prevent and eliminate illegal movements, and Article 69, where there are migrant workers and members of their families within in an irregular situation, states have to take appropriate measures to ensure the situation doesn't persist. This is supposed to be a human rights treaty. States are obliged to stop this. As a matter of international law, this used to be a matter of domestic policy only, but obviously only for states parties of this treaty. But states can consider the possibility of regularizing the situation. States have that opportunity of dealing with this situation by, instead of expelling them, allowing them to become permanent residents, for example. And again, Article 79, nothing in the Convention shall affect the right of each state party to establish the criteria for governing admission of migrant workers. So again, recognizing that states have a right and entitlement to prevent people from accessing their territory. So this treaty has been described by Linda Bosniak as a hybrid document that at one and the same time is a ringing declaration of individual rights and a staunch manifesto in support of state territorial sovereignty. So already we've seen in relation to undocumented migrants, and this is one of the groups that I wanted to look at, undocumented migrants, already we have seen that even the treaty that is designed to offer some protection to undocumented migrants does it at the cost of making it an international obligation of a state to clamp down on clandestine movements of people. Many people, as you saw in the documentary, unable to acquire the right documents to leave their country of origin to perhaps flee to another country, they use the services of traffickers and smugglers. So I'm going to be looking at the human rights of trafficked and smuggled persons. Now, you may hear an awful lot in the news or social media about human trafficking and the scourge of human trafficking and how terrible trafficking is and how ghastly the traffickers are. This is not to say that traffickers are nice people. We saw clearly that traffickers are engaged in illicit profiteering at the expense of human life in getting people across the Mediterranean, for example. Then they're not necessarily nice people at all. But nevertheless, the rhetoric around trafficking is a human rights rhetoric. That the Human Trafficking Protocol, which is the first treaty at the UN level, or the only treaty at the UN level, which is directed at trying to clamp down on trafficking, the rhetoric is human rights. We are protecting human beings from the scourge of traffickers. And even many human rights organizations will talk about human trafficking from a human rights perspective. Now, that's not a bad thing at all. I don't have anything against human rights, not at all, far from it. But it is the idea that the Trafficking Protocol as a human rights treaty is the thing that I find most difficult to understand. The Trafficking Protocol offers very little in the way of protection for those who are trafficked. The persons who are trafficked are regarded as victims, but there is no immunity from prosecution for having crossed a border illegally. So you can be trafficked and be a victim, but at the same time you can be prosecuted for having crossed a border illegally. And the rights that are guaranteed in the Trafficking Protocol are articulated very loosely. So Article 6 of the Trafficking Protocol says this: in appropriate cases and to the extent possible, states shall protect privacy and identity of victims of trafficking. Then in Article 6, paragraph 3, each state party shall consider implementing, not shall implement, shall consider implementing measures to provide for the physical, psychological, and social recovery. And they can include housing, counselling, etc., etc. There is no obligation under this treaty for a state to provide for or to protect the human rights of trafficked people. As for those who are smuggled, so broadly speaking, the difference between those who are trafficked and those who are smuggled is those who are trafficked are coerced in some way, and end up as a result of that coercion in exploitative labor. You might be smuggled and not coerced, but end up in exploitative labor, but you won't be regarded as a person who's been trafficked unless you have suffered that coercion. The reality is that the distinction between smuggling and trafficking is almost impossible to determine. You've seen how people talked about smugglers and traffickers on that documentary. You've seen the man with the gun. You've seen how they are herded onto unfit, I was going to say vehicles, unfit vessels. And you've seen how the people who steer those vessels have no training. But it's almost impossible when they arrive in Greece to determine who's been trafficked and who's been smuggled. So the problem with the Trafficking Protocol is, although there is this huge rhetoric about protecting victims of trafficking, the reality is the human rights protections are almost completely absent from that particular treaty. That is not to say that there aren't other treaties. There's a Council of Europe treaty, which is significantly better in human rights obligations. But this is a UN Trafficking Protocol, which was the first one to kind of be articulated. In relation to the smuggled, even fewer rights are available to them. And the protocol, whilst specifically prohibiting prosecutions for those who have been smuggled, which is odd because there's no mirror image of that in the Trafficking Protocol, the smuggling protocol specifically permits states to prosecute those who've been smuggled for breach of domestic law. In other words, that would include status offences. Status offences being, not having the right documentation. So, in other words, under both the smuggling protocol and the trafficking protocol, victims are not really regarded as human beings with human rights. They are regarded as criminals or potential criminals that need to be prosecuted. And indeed, in both of the treaties, states parties to the treaty, the kind of sending state, if you like, the state from which the person has fled has an obligation to receive the persons back again as a matter of international law now. So I might flee from Syria, arrive in the UK, having used a trafficker. I can be prosecuted for having crossed the border illegally, and I can be sent back to Syria, I can't remember if Syria's ratified the treaty, and Syria has an obligation to take me back. Now, there are some caveats around that because refugee law comes into play, and it may be that I could seek and gain protection under the Refugee Convention. But you see the point I'm getting at, that human rights inhere in the individual and the human being, and yet when it comes to migrants, different categories of migrants, they are somehow a subsection of human beings, and somehow their human rights get eclipsed behind the rhetoric, which is we must protect our borders. We cannot be overrun by refugees, by bogus asylum seekers, by economic migrants. The word I talk to a lot of intelligent people when I walk my dog, and they ask me about my, what I do for a living, and we talk about migrants, and they say, but, what about economic migrants? I mean, surely. And I said to them, who do you think these people are? Everybody's an economic migrant, including refugees. They all want to be able to provide for themselves and their family. Everyone is an economic migrant. So, these categories that are bandied about in order to try and other and separate and diminish and reduce to a tiny core that the availability of human rights is, I think, deeply worrying. And as I say, challenges our rhetoric in relation to universality. Just wanted to say a couple of things more about undocumented migrants. Because for the most part, that's what we're dealing with these days. Is the problems that states are encountering and the problems that migrants are encountering are usually when they are in an undocumented status. It's difficult for us to estimate with accuracy, or rather, it's difficult for us to obtain accurate and up-to-date figures on undocumented migrants, which is, of course, the nature of the beast, because people are under the radar. However, in 2010, the UN ODC estimated that there were 50 million undocumented migrants worldwide. This is quite a chunk of people, of whom roughly 11.3 million lived in the USA in 2014. So, as Bosniak points out, as the international economy has deteriorated, migration is increasingly seen as a threat to national security, as I said at the outset. Increased border controls have served to illegalize or criminalize migration and driven migration underground. And as I said, it's driven workers into more precarious and dangerous working conditions. It's driven them into more precarious and dangerous living conditions. The problem for states is that no matter how tight their borders are, no matter how many walls they erect, no matter how many biometric data and so on they take, there will always be people who are on the move. There will always be people who enter or who remain on their territories illegally. And these are the undocumented. And they include students who've overstayed their visas, or students who work in breach of their visas, in breach of their student visas, tourists who overstay, persons whose work permits have expired, persons who've been smuggled on false documents, and persons who have failed in their claims to seek asylum. All of these end up being undocumented. And as Linda Bosniak, that I mentioned earlier, a scholar, said, most of these migrants will stay and most of them will end up working. And this makes them, as I said earlier, particularly vulnerable to exploitation. And the problem is that undocumented migrants are almost never going to raise their head above the parapet and claim any human rights to which they might be entitled because they risk being brought to the attention of the authorities and being deported, removed, sent to somewhere unsafe. The Migrant Workers Convention marked a step in the right direction in that it acknowledges the fact that there are irregular workers in most countries and provides some protection for them. And it acknowledges the state's power to control their borders, but it also undermines the rights of the undocumented, it seems to me. As I say, undocumented migrants won't even be able to claim those rights in that convention if the state concerned has ratified that treaty, because they won't want to bring their head above the parapet. Undocumented migrants whose numbers are on the increase are amongst the most vulnerable migrants in the world. And human rights treaties, whilst they purport to offer human rights to all, simply cannot provide the protection that undocumented persons need or are arguably entitled to. And Hannah Arendt, writing about statelessness between the wars, between the wars, during World War II and after the war, observed that those who had their nationality stripped from them had lost their right to have rights. And it seems to me that undocumented persons have also lost their right to have rights. And she remarks on an absurdity which I think which brings it into really sharp focus. She said that if a stateless person with absolutely no rights would commit a crime, automatically they would be accorded certain rights. They would be accorded rights of an accused person. They would have a right to counsel. They would have a right, in some cases, to legal aid. They would have a right to a fair trial. So curiously, those stateless people suddenly, on committing a crime, had certain rights. And it seems to me that this is germane also to the situation of the undocumented in our modern era. At the moment of the arrest, the stateless person has a right to a fair trial, and so on, and those rights will pertain right to the end of the prison of any prison sentence. Now, some people say, well, people left their country voluntarily, and they came to our country in breach of our laws, and so they should be deemed illegal, criminal, and so on. But I wonder, looking at that documentary, in respect of how many undocumented migrants we can say they left their country voluntarily. The problem is so many people are forced through circumstances beyond their own control to leave their country. They feel they have no choice. You saw the man in Aleppo saying, I can't live here. I can't get married here. I have no future here. And then you saw him trying to escape, laughing at the incompetence of the sniper. I mean, laughing is a way of managing our fear. Hannah Arendt argues that refugees and the stateless have attached themselves like a curse to all the newly established states that were created in the image of the nation states. And she said that they are like this. They are like a deadly sickness. She says that the nation cannot exist once the principle of equality before the law has broken down. And she said that without equality before the law, the nation dissolves into an anarchic mess of over and underprivileged people. If you saw the fire in Grenfell building, you can see what, the over and the underprivileged absolutely brought into focus there. Laws that are not for all, she argued, revert to rights and privileges, which is contrary to the very essence of the modern state. What I'm suggesting is that the place of the migrant, which challenges the universality of human rights, actually goes, my argument goes further than that. The place of the undocumented migrant is, I think, the challenge to the notion that our democratic states have the ability to protect rights on an equal footing to all who happen to be in their jurisdiction. And I think that the undocumented suffer, not identically, obviously, because fortunately we are not seeing the mass extermination of undocumented migrants, but I think that there are some very unsettling parallels that we can draw between the stateless under the Nazi regime and the undocumented of our current regime. So to conclude, undocumented migrants, trafficked, smuggled, asylum seekers, and to some extent refugees are all vulnerable categories of human beings. All are at risk of being detained. All are at risk of being mistreated, exploited, and none are guaranteed the full panoply of human rights that are deemed to inhere in the human person by virtue of their humanity. They are, by human rights standards themselves, I would argue, second-class citizens.